back on events which have altered the course of history. This week, Ardeshir Zahedi talks to our former Tehran correspondent, Andrew Whitley.
The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was one of those great convulsive moments of 20th century history. A monarchy with a lineage claiming to stretch back some 2,500 years was swept aside in a huge wave of popular protest. Into its shoes stepped the Shia clergy, creating the contemporary world's only theocracy. At their head was the forbidding figure of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the Imam as he was known to his legions of followers. Unlike many so-called revolutions, in reality palace coups staged by ever more junior bands of army officers, the events that led to the downfall of the Shah of Iran sprang from the ground. Millions of peasants, uprooted from their farms and turned into factory workers at a wave of the monarch's wand, felt adrift in an alien new world. City dwellers felt cheated of the Western-style standard of living promised them, as corruption mounted and the economic boom ran into serious trouble. Lawyers bridled at the Shah's high-handed disregard for the rule of law. Poets and playwrights chafed under the heavy hand of censorship. Nationalist politicians, long repressed by an all-pervasive secret police force, grumbled out loud as Iran's destiny appeared tied ever more tightly to the coattails of the West. To all appearances, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was a man of supreme self-confidence, convinced of his own glorious destiny and that of his ancient country. The two were interlinked in his mind. To achieve his highly ambitious goal of vaulting Iran into the first rank of the world's nations within a single generation, all obstacles would have to be brushed aside. In an interview for British television in 1975, the King of Kings, as he styled himself, was at his most imperious.
I have absolute power, maybe, because things have turned this way. Complete trust of my people for me and vice versa. And that's proven several times, not only once. I am dedicated to my country because this is the most beautiful thing that could happen. What could I take away with me when I go in the grave? Not even a dress, maybe just a piece of white cloth, that's all. So I'm philosophical enough to know these things. And I have enough for the earthly needs. So what I've got to take with me in the grave is history.
History was not, however, to be written in the way that the Shah had imagined. To contemporary eyes, those tumultuous months of 1978 and early 1979 have the air of a Greek tragedy, moving towards a preordained conclusion. It seemed as if there was nothing that the Shah could do to break the downward slide. In counterpoint, the power of the clergy, long derided by the regime as ignorant, obscurantist mullahs, appeared to grow unchecked. Each wave of popular disturbances would produce a fresh crop of victims, martyrs whose blood would galvanize the radical clergymen and their followers to fresh efforts. As the summer of 1978 moved into the autumn, and the once all-powerful Shah appeared strangely paralyzed in the face of events he could barely comprehend, all the separate strands of discontent in Iran came together. Massive crowds, 1 million, even 2 million strong, unshaven workers marching alongside society ladies, turned out onto Iran's streets to tell the Shah that his 37-year-old rule had come to an end. Death to the Shah, death to America, and Khomeini is our leader, they chanted. Finally, on a cold January day, the Shah, accompanied by Empress Farah and a handful of aides, slipped quietly out of the embattled Iranian capital and into exile. Looking back on the final months of the Shah's rule, it might seem as if nothing could have stemmed the tide of protest. One man who to this day, however, feels strongly that the tide could have been reversed is Ardeshir Zahedi. Zahedi and his father, General Fazlallah Zahedi, had been among the Shah's closest followers. They played a key role in restoring the young monarch to power in 1953, overthrowing the nationalist leader Mohammad Mossadegh, and they were well rewarded for their pains. The old general became prime minister. His son married the Shah's eldest daughter and was later made foreign minister. At the time of the revolutionary turmoil, Ardeshir Zahedi was Iran's flamboyant and influential ambassador to Washington. There he had the ear of President Jimmy Carter and his top foreign policy advisors. In Washington, Zahedi may have been temporarily out of the mainstream of Iranian life. He had one inestimable advantage over his other rivals in the political cockpit. His close relationship to the ruler. His marriage to the Shah's daughter had ended in divorce, but the aloof monarch continued to treat Ardeshir almost as his own son. By the summer of 1978, Zahedi was anxious to get back to Tehran to help out. The Shah's closest confidant, Asadullah Alam, had died the previous winter. A long-serving Prime Minister, Amir Abbas Hoveda, was in jail, thrown to the wolves beginning to bay for the Shah's own blood. There was no one around willing or able to stiffen the Shah's nerve and give him some good advice. Characteristically, into this breach stepped Ardeshir Zahedi.
That evening, when I arrived, it was very late. At the airport, the Foreign Minister, the Chief of Staff, and many of the civilians among the Foreign Office people, and some of the friends, Senator and Member of the Parliament were there. And that was very surprising because I was supposed to go very quietly. And everybody wanted to talk to me about the situation. Well, then when I went and had audience with His Majesty, which was about 1:30, 1:45 in the morning, I first noticed that His Majesty is terribly tired. He is very unhappy. And he very sincerely was talking to me that he would want to give all the power possible to the government to solve it. Part of this problem, I think, started. It was a fight between Hoveda, who had resigned as a Prime Minister, and Jamshid Amuzagar, who has become a Prime Minister. They were fighting against each other, so they had a division, and the people were getting a wrong signal.
You went back to Iran, obviously at a time when many people were leaving the country, many of the Shah's closest advisors. Did you find His Majesty in a state of mind where he could actually make decisions, though? Was he able to think coherently and make rational plans for his future?
No. And I was worried. And I loved this man. And I didn't know. Because that time I did not know his. I was begging him. I was asking him that he did not want to see anyone. I was asking him that if he sees his chief of armies, just to pass through in the morning. Many times. I arranged for him once. He went to the Air Force. And he was kissed and loved, and you must have been with some of your colleagues. But sadly, I see that he is not, of course, he once complained to me that he has a problem. I had very confidentially briefed the doctor, and we thought it was his heart. Actually, he was not in a good position. I would understand it because he was tired, he couldn't sleep well, he had fights with his wife at night, which the Queen was telling me the next day. So, a lot of things which has actually they were destroying this man. Plus, he had a cancer and he was not let us know and anybody knew about it.
Let's move on then to the events that were happening in Tehran at this time, because soon after you came back, one of the most dramatic events, which marked a landmark for the opposition, were the shootings that took place in downtown Tehran in Jaleh Square, an event that later became known to all sides to the world as Black Friday, when many people were killed.
130.
Can you tell us how much of an impact did that have on the Shah and on the government? How serious an event was it?
First of all, I think that was the cause of the mistakes of government. Because that time, especially that Thursday, when I was having dinner with His Majesty, and Her Majesty the Queen was there too, the Prime Minister, when the Shah called me, he said, the Prime Minister telephoned me and they want to have a martial law. I said, Your Majesty, I think you have to be a little bit careful on that. And I went to the palace. And I was there that evening for a long period of time, for hours after dinner, the children come. I was against martial law. And that I explained to the Majesty, that the government should decide not with you. And the Prime Minister called a few times. And His Majesty resisted. And this conversation went on till about 2 o'clock in the morning, which finally, this time His Majesty went to the bedroom, to the next room, to take the call from the Prime Minister, so I would not intervene. And when the army, that was again another thing I was against. You should never bring the army and let them sit in the streets for days and nights in this heat. If you need army, you bring them, they do just their job, they go back to their barracks. That was again a big mistake. And this is why I was against the martial law from the beginning.
As you say, clearly the government was mishandling the situation. It didn't prepare for it properly. But it was a tragic event nonetheless, which had a landmark effect on the opposition.
The reason was this.
Did you feel that somehow it had given some fresh strength to the opposition against the Shah?
Indeed, because you see, by that time I had arranged for Amini Intezam, who was our former minister, to come and see the Shah. I have arranged different people.
These were people who were broken from the Shah in the past.
Yes, they were actually, but these people were in the cabinet for many years. So I brought these people that His Majesty would talk.
What you were trying to do was, you were trying to bring back old respected figures of people who you thought could be a national conciliation.
Yes, I always thought that if we bring, because Iran is in a way tribal country, if we bring different people from different parts of the country, which has a good name, they sit together and they could advise the Shah, and each of them belong to the family. This way, they would be, first of all, since they feel they are responsible, they would act more responsible. And secondly, we would leave the king out of being always using his name, because everything we want to do, and we did not want to do it in our name, we are afraid, we use the name of the Shah. Alright, if it went good, it was good. If it's bad, the Shah is blamed. And this is why on that martial law, I said, let the government decide themselves not to involve.
Well, let's now listen to what the Shah himself had to say about those events at that particular time.
This would permit to establish law and order, which was unfortunately not respected before. And there were so many acts of arson, and I think it was on Friday, there were 100 cases of arson in the city of Tehran alone. And the demonstrators were not abiding by the laws. So they were almost taking the laws in their own hands. That is not freedom, it is not democracy.
We heard the Shah here talking to a foreign audience to explain how these things happen and talking about freedom and democracy. Now, there are many people who are cynical who think that the Shah would only talk to the Western audience about these things and that he spoke in a different language to Iran. You knew him very well. You believed that he was sincere when he talked about full democracy. After all, he had a reputation as a very autocratic monarch. And at this late stage in the game,
I really believe very, very deeply that he wanted them. But sometimes with the circumstances, as being an individual, as being a human, because I think the power and money sadly destroyed people. And this was partly sometime which would put him off course.
But if the military had truly cracked down, if they had been ordered to use all their force, and this was a very mighty war machine that had been built up by the Shah over the years with American help, could they really have made a difference? After all, there were those who said that the ordinary soldiers themselves, the recruits who came from the villages, uneducated people, were not prepared to go on fighting and shooting against their own people.
That I am not accepted, I mean, the last part. But yes, maybe, as what you say today, it's happened in Algeria. Maybe that would have been done. So God knows, I don't know.
Ayatollah Khomeini, as we all now know, is the person later came to power as the sole undisputed leader of the opposition. It was clear, though, that during the summer of 1978, that he was not the only leader of the opposition. There were many different factions. There were secular opposition leaders from the old nationalists. There were people you might describe as liberals or people who wanted constitutional monarchy. There was the domestic clergy, some of whom had close ties with the establishment, the very prominent religious leaders, but who nonetheless were playing a part in helping to organize these demonstrations. They were playing the game both ways, if you like, playing with the government and also playing with the opposition. Now, Khomeini eventually came out on top as the single most important leader, and it seems to me, from my vantage point in Tehran at that time, that one of the reasons for this was that the Shah gave no encouragement at all to the National Front, the secular opposition leaders of the past, and eventually they decided to throw in their support to the most radical person, Ayatollah Khomeini, abroad. Is this something
I do not agree. I do not. First of all, who was National Front? You have 13 people. They were divided among themselves. They hated each other. When Dr. Sadeghi wanted to accept the prime ministership, the other denounced him. When Bakhtiyar came and accepted the prime ministership, the others denounced him. So each of them wanted to be a power themselves. And it was, the National Front did not have any strong power. And the result was, first of all, Ayatollah Shariat Madari was the strong man.
He was the prominent religious leader of the country.
Ayatollah Shariat Madari called His Majesty. I was involved in that. And asked the Shah not to leave. Ayatollah from Iraq asked the same. So Khomeini was being outside, getting so much publicity, and religious Because that time then it was Ayatollah Ghani and all who really became a kind of cooperation with Khomeini. And this was giving us strength.
But would you have regarded Khomeini as the single leader of the opposition at this time when you were advising the Shah?
No. That time actually Shah Ismail was more powerful. Khomeini became Khomeini after the overthrow of the Shah. Because during that period, last period, because he was the one sitting outside and saying he has to go. As I said, there were so many sadly different things. The government was not capable. They were fighting with each other. The opposition were divided and they were lying. Each of them would come, one accept the other one, they would not want to do anything with them. So I think that there were quite a lot of things worked together. The government in the United States, which they did not give a clear signal, three different ones. In Great Britain, you had a Labour government, which they did not know what to do, because I had talked with the ambassador, Peter J., that time in Washington. This is why I suggested that American and the British should go together, because each of them would go and say a completely different thing and confuse the Shah. His Majesty has said it in his book that he was very confused. He couldn't believe me, because he wouldn't know whether I'd have believed me as his ambassador to Washington or American ambassador. President Carter has said it in his book as well.
As you say that the Carter administration was giving mixed signals, perhaps you could give us your perspective as to how you saw the divisions between the State Department and the White House over dealing with Iran.
I agree with you. I think there was almost, I would say, there was no policy, because the State Department, the Secretary of State, I don't know whether he had any policy or he was changing. In the White House, the President was a wonderful person, but he did not have a geopolitical background. Zbigniew Brzezinski, national security, had completely different, and the CIA. So I think it was a confusion among themselves.
What were they urging on you? What were they recommending for you to tell the Shah to do?
Well, the President of the United States were asking me to tell the Shah that you should have a stand fair and you should do everything possible. For instance, the President asked me, don't worry about what the promise you have about the human rights. And yet, in the coming out in the press or in some officials, the signal was completely different.
Perhaps we should then hear what President Carter had to say later on that year about the policy towards Iran.
I fully expect the Shah to maintain power in Iran and for the present problems in Iran to be resolved. Although there have been certainly deplorable instances of bloodshed, we certainly want to avoid or see avoided. I think the predictions of doom and disaster that came from some sources have certainly not been realized at all.
You see, here we see the President, which he says in the beginning, he wanted to show to state, and yes, at the same time he's deploring what is happening. The same thing he tells me. Here the President of the United States come to Iran, make a speech, and he said Iran is the island of stability in the whole world. And then we get the different signal when he goes to United States. One day saying one thing, and one day another thing. One day telling to their ambassador something, and one day to me. That would be confusing.
Meanwhile, he must have been very dispirited by the way that the opposition was organizing increasingly larger demonstrations, and they were able to bring out people from all walks of life. It started off as people from the clergy supporters, but then more and more middle-class people, the sort of people who benefited from the Shah's reforms in the past, were coming out onto the streets and taking part in these huge demonstrations. Yes. This must have been very discouraging.
But it is discouraging, unfortunately, anywhere in the world. You have a group of people who change color whenever the wind goes. First of all, I believe if the Shah would not have left country, Khomeini would never have come to Iran. If the Shah would not have left the country, the army would not have collapsed. And because of that, if that would have happened, then we would have a change. Even if the Shah wanted to abdicate and go, the change would have been something which would not destroy the economy of the country and the bloodshed and the misery we have seen then or now in Iran.
So what were you advising him? Were you telling him to stand firm? Or
I said, no, I would advise him that he should try to make the opposition. As a matter of fact, 3 times I prepared the list that from all over the country, people would be represented, and the member of the parliament and the member of the Senate, and he would come to it. And I said, big tent in the palace, and he would come and said, I am tired, I want you to decide whom you want as a prime minister. You choose 2 or 3, I would choose one of them. He agreed 2 or 3 times, and yet, again, it was changed. because of those things, I was actually trying to say, all right, we have to make a compromise between the opposition, and this was the thing which I had in my heart for a long time. At the same time, I was against that the Shah would leave the country, because I told him many times, once in front of Her Majesty, that if you leave, you never come back. Once I was very mad, and I told him that if you leave and you think your wife or your son could take your place, you are wrong. That was a night which General Heiser was coming to Iran, and he said it was without his permission, and I was very mad. I said, either arrest him, tell the MP arrest him, or get him out of the country. How could a general come to the country without head of state's permission?
General Heiser, as we only later learnt, was sent by the Americans for a rather strange mission. It wasn't clear whether he was there to help strengthen the military or to persuade them, as some thought, to mount a coup against the opposition.
To be very honest and frank with you, I don't think even he or American administration knew, because in the beginning there was a talk that Brzezinski, head of national security, would come. And then there was a talk that maybe Mr. Schlesinger, James Schlesinger, then it was Al Haig, which all of them refused, and in the end it come to him. He came in order to help the army, in my opinion, to make a coup. But in the end, first of all, the Shah was not happy. His Majesty asked, and I was telling him that evening, that everybody knows he said, it came without my permission, which I suggested that either he should be arrested or he should be sent back by the same plane. Secondly, the army people were not happy because they thought it's an insult that he would come. Thirdly, there was the fight between the General Heiser himself and the Ambassador of the United States. General Heiser, I have seen many times in Washington, have lunch with me, and I have a letter from him. However, I don't believe, A, it was helpful, B, I don't know whether he actually himself knew what he's doing.
Who would he have
and the administration, the man who was in contact, it was the Ministry of Defense with him, which Mr. Brown, nice gentleman.
Who would he have made a coup against? Would it have been a royalist coup? And if so, to do what?
I think it was in mind of the American, some of American maybe, CIA or the defense or the White House, wherever, that if the worst come to worst, they thought maybe they would make a coup with the army, Shah going, the same thing probably they did in Greek, which we call it the coup of the colonels. They get rid of the king, but however, the situation will
a pro-American military government
would have stayed. The mistake was, if you don't have the military, which all his royalty is in the top, as His Majesty the Shah was, the moment you take him away, the whole thing would collapse. This, I think, our American friends could not understand.
So it was a policy based on a lack of judgment about
in my opinion, sadly, yes.
What, in your opinion, Mr. Zahedi, with all these mistakes, was the most crucial blunder that the various governments inside Iran made during these final months?
I don't think we had a government. Here you have 3 governments, less than 14 months, and each of them, without being able to do anything, were leaving, and the other one would come with a big noise and no power. At the same time, when we had a military government, that for 5 weeks, Dr. Sadeghi, who was supposed to become Prime Minister from National Front, was talking, and everybody knows in the street. Same time, after he could not arrange because he had fight among his own group and his own colleagues, then was Bakhtiar came to power, and that time Bakhtiar was actually, instead of working with the military, he used a lot of things against the military. So that itself, it was actually disintegrating the morale of the army. And this kind of fight among the personality on the top who would become responsible and would get, if I want to become Minister of Interior, not the Minister of War, this kind of thing, or I should have been appointed Prime Minister. These things also, and I think also the head of the Savak Daftan was, in the end, was not playing his role correctly.
In the end, perhaps this mission of General Heiser's was counterproductive. It led to a disintegration of the morale in the armed forces.
I couldn't agree with you more. Many of these generals came to me. One of them even wanted to shoot him. Was this General Heiser trip coming there, it made them more confused, and they took it as he has come to tell them, don't be loyal to your king, which they could not swallow.
So in the end, they had to get out and save themselves, whichever way they could.
They were all destroyed. They were not, none of them were saved. You know how many generals they killed, how many colonels, how many civilians. It was a massacre which is sad for me and shame for me to say that I never know and I never could believe that Iranian could do that, especially in the name of God and an special name of religion.
So in the end, what do you think was the final thing that made the Shah decide that he had to go?
That was when the American ambassador goes to him, as His Majesty has mentioned in his memoirs, and asks him that he should leave early. As a matter of fact, in one place which is His Majesty explaining that the ambassador was looking at his watch, that means if you leave now, it's better than an hour later. And that, I think, either embarrassed him or made him mad or weakened him. Whatever was the last decision, and at the same time, the British ambassador.
So finally he listened to the foreign ambassadors and not to you, his partner who was closest to him.
Sadly, that was because he had a respect for foreigners and he would always listen. And he believed that he can work with them. And that respect maybe it was too much and destroyed him.
Zahedi believed passionately that even at this late hour, the Shah could save himself. He would have to hand over much of his power and become a genuine constitutional monarch. But provided he stood firm, negotiated with his opponents, and refused to leave the country, he could survive on the throne. Instead, the Shah dithered, and the growing chaos in the country engulfed a plan which, if implemented some months earlier, might have had a chance of success. In the dark last days of December 1978, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi came to the conclusion that his time was up and he would have to leave. But where was he to go? Zahedi was heavily preoccupied in trying to improvise some arrangements. There was no obvious safe haven. Egypt offered the Shah temporary refuge, so it was to Cairo that the monarch first flew. From there it was on to Morocco, the Bahamas, Mexico, the United States, and Panama, before returning to Egypt again. Hounded from pillar to post, the seriously ill Shah had become, in Henry Kissinger's phrase, the Flying Dutchman. Zahedi himself flew out of Tehran a few days before the end, as an advance guard for the royal family. But quarrels broke out in the Shah's dwindling entourage. Angry over the shabby treatment being accorded to him and his monarch, Zahedi decided to return to his family house on Lake Geneva. From there, he reflects with some pain on the way the West dealt with the Shah.
It's not bitterness anymore, because I would know that it's not a country, those people in the country doing it, they have a government. We have seen changes in United States as well as in Europe. So, but yet, yes, it was kind of disappointing. It made me sad. And it was a very bad experience for me because I had much bigger view of the European culture, European morality. It was European or American Western morality in my head, which I was also loved to have in my country as a democratic country. And yet I saw in here is a double edge. There's a kind of hypocrisy I saw, which makes me sad.
Ardeshir Zahedi was talking to Andrew Whitley.